is words, and words are thoughts, and thoughts are Buddha's expertise, I promise. This is what Buddha is talking about, the mind, and how to change it. So this prayer, the first part, is expressing for those of us in the room who kind of feel we are already Buddhist. It's reminding us of our reliance on the Buddha, the Dharma, and so on. But the second two lines can be for all of us. It's expressing an altruistic reason or motivation for our being here together tonight, this weekend, to listen to the Buddha's teachings about happiness, suffering, reality, what is true, what is not, the purpose of all this, which is to take some tools from it to help us develop what Buddha would say is our incredible potential, so that we can in turn be of benefit to others. This is the idea. So we think this is why we're here. Sangye chadang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penche sangye drobha shok Sangye chadang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki Drola penche sangye drobha shok Sangye chadang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyab suchi Dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki Drola penche sangye drobha shok. Okay. Well, you could say that everything in Buddha's teachings, everything from the very beginning, from A to Z, everything is leading us. The teachings, in fact, in particular, the way they package the teachings in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, everything is leading us to the understanding of emptiness. This is the word, you know. These are the words. So, and there's so many ways of describing all of this, so many sort of doorways into Buddhism. But just to remind us, every time it's so important to remind us of who is this person Buddha, you know, because we are probably coming from Sweden is a Christian, got a Christian history. I've come from a Catholic background, and because in the world, I think almost the default assumption that religion equals creator, you know. So then here I'm a Buddhist, looks pretty holy, I just prostrated, we just sang prayers, I'm a nun, it sounds like religion again. And of course it's true, you ask a Buddhist, a Tibetan, are you religious? Of course they'll say. But they don't have the view of creator, and that's the kind of the shock in the normal way the world thinks about spiritual or religious teachings. So it's really important to remind us of this, because that informs us about how to listen to Buddha's teachings. So, you know, when I was a Catholic, and I was a very devoted Catholic, I mean, even though I was very naughty, I was also very devoted, thought about God the whole time, and wanted to understand the way the universe is, you know, and I thought about God. But and I was taught that God is the boss, basically, isn't it? There's a being, an energy that is the source of the universe, of sentient beings, is the cause of everything, and so therefore God is to be obeyed. That's completely correct. Just like in my household, my mother was the boss, and she was to be obeyed, and that's very much our view, I think, in the world of even morality. You know, someone else says you must do this. If you're a good girl, you get rewarded, and if you're a naughty girl, you get punished. That's the view we have in our minds, very deep, you know. So, but that's not the Buddha's view. In Buddhism, there's no concept of a punishment. There's no concept of reward, because that implies somebody punishing and rewarding. And in Buddhism, there's no such idea. So it takes us time to hear this, you know, because the fact is, he was a regular guy. He came out of this incredible Hindu tradition. I mean, it was a few months ago I read the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, said that it was the Hindus, actually, during the last 3,000 years, who are the ones who came up with this extraordinary investigation of the nature of self, and which is actually psychology. And again, if you look at Hindus, no one would think psychology. We just think religion, you know. Buddha is the same. So it was the Hindus who began this astonishing investigation into the very nature of what is a person, what makes us tick, what is happiness, what is suffering, And out of this extraordinary tradition, the basis of all what is now Buddhist psychology, Buddha came out of this tradition. He went to all the great masters, he continued in his own way, he then diverged and came up with his own findings about many things, in particular, precisely about actually what the self is, and that's where the emptiness teachings comes in. That's Buddha's unique approach. So really it's really important to remember Buddha, coming out of the Hindu tradition, is this astonishing, clear, intelligent, sophisticated psychology. Even all the Buddhist teachings about the nature of mind are coming from the Hindu tradition, you know. So, I mean, since then, that's why for me, in my life, I generally have incredible respect for anybody who is looking into these things. Call it religious, Muslim, Catholic, I don't care. You know, in the last 100 years since Mr. Freud, you know, in the West, we're now talking about psychology. Before that, it was always the soul. So the Buddha's one is coming from the Hindu one, but he's got his own unique approach. So the point about the Buddha is this. What's called Buddhism was not revealed to him. We think of teachings as revelation, you know. I always remember in New Zealand, one, in fact, scientist, and this is the only time I've ever heard this question in my entire life. Usually we all ask the same questions. Wherever I go, we all have the same questions. But this one question, only one person's ever asked. He said, who revealed the teachings to the Buddha? Because that's our view of religion, isn't it? You know, and I'm not being rude here. God is the source, you know, but for the Buddha, he is not a creator. He doesn't assert a creator. He doesn't assert a boss. He says we are the boss. We are the ones who create ourselves. We are the ones who create our own suffering, who create our own happiness. We don't need to be punished or rewarded. Our own behavior does it. And this is the view of karma, which we can talk about. We will talk about. But it takes time to really, experientially get the implication of this, which is accountability. Because Buddha was a regular guy who, from his own intensely hard work, his own inner investigation, using these marvelous psychological tools that we now know called mindfulness, this technique that's so common in the world now, which is fantastic. This came straight from the Hindus, you know, this incredibly sophisticated psychological technique that enables you to plumb the depths of your own mind, to unpack and unravel and deconstruct the rubbish, rid the mind of the rubbish, and fully develop the goodness, which is essentially what Buddha's saying. So Buddha was a person who did this. So everything that's called Buddhism is coming from his own experience. It's like if I were Einstein here, every word I say, you'd have to deduce, if I'm a valid scientist, it's come from my own experience. You know, it's come from my own investigation and my own observations and my own direct experience. That's what any person is. A good musician, a good scientist, they've done the work themselves. They then proceed to present to you their findings. That's the Buddha. So every word that's called Buddhism, and as long as it's valid, lots of people write ridiculous things and call it Buddhism, so you've got to be careful. You should check up whom you're hearing, that they are valid, that this place is valid, you know, that you get valid people talking here, not just making up rubbish. That, that is experiential, coming from the Buddha. And so this is why then, you know, even though Buddhism has this approach, we get a bit confused when we hear about past lives, reincarnation, karma, because immediately we feel, well, how can you prove this? Well, if Buddha was a regular guy who came to these direct observations, obviously it can be proved because he proved it himself. So he lays out his methodology, and then it's up to anyone who takes Buddhism on board in their own life. Or the way I like to put it, I never say I believe in karma. I don't ever say those words. I always prefer to say Buddhism is my working hypothesis, you know, which is what a good scientist would do. And that means you're engaging in it, and you're experiencing it, and you're proving it eventually to yourself to be true. You're verifying it, or not, as the case may be. As the Dalai Lama says, if you follow the steps that Buddha says, and you actually don't get the same experience, and I really mean follow what he says, then Buddha's wrong. You must reject him, you know. So this is the kind of this is the approach, actually. So if we've never heard these words, let's say in this room before, or if you've heard them 1,000 times, the best way to listen is freshly, you know, to hear it every time freshly. And as we're listening, to take it on board as this hypothesis, you know, we can't prove these things immediately. You can't prove relativity immediately. You've got to start small and you go towards it, but you've got to have it as your hypothesis, otherwise you won't bother even trying, you know. So that's very much the approach here. So what does Buddha say? You know, what's he saying? Well, where we're heading with the realization of emptiness combined with bodhicitta, this is the Mahayana view, you know, a bird needs two wings, Buddha says, wisdom, compassion. So the wisdom wing is the development of this, the development of this wisdom, is the way they talk about it. And then there's the compassion wing, the development of bodhicitta, and the exchanging self for others and becoming this infinitely kind, loving, compassionate person who never gives up wanting to help others, but based upon wisdom. As the Dalai Lama says, compassion is not enough. You need wisdom. The bird needs two wings. And this is very much the Mahayana approach, you know. So the teachings are leading us internally to our direct insight into how things exist. And then we combine that with the compassion wing. So what does it mean? What does it mean to see how things exist? This seems quite odd, you know. Why would be Buddha telling us how things exist? Well, we have to conclude is because he thinks right now, which is what he's saying, we're not in touch with how things exist. And what he says is that's why there is suffering, which is really kind of quite counterintuitive. That not being in sync with reality is why we suffer. It's kind of surprising to us, you know. Because Buddha's deal is what goes on in our mind is the source of our happiness and the source of our suffering. What goes on out there plays a role, but for him, the mind, what goes on in here, plays the main role. So basically, this is the entry into Buddhism we're discussing here, the one of developing wisdom, which means we need to understand the mind, this human mind of ours. And that is Buddha's expertise. Buddhist psychology, you know, goes to incredible depths of clarity and precision, which is what, if one is seriously wanting to take on board Buddhism in their lives, we need to understand Buddha's model of the mind. It's so distinct, it's so unique, even though the words seem quite familiar to us, you know. So basically, what Buddha's saying is that every single sentient being, every person, the term in Tibetan is a lovely word for a sentient being, a mind possessor. Senchen, mind possessor. And by the way, there are trillions of mind possessors, not just humans. All the animals are mind possessors. And there are many beings that Buddha would suggest exist that we can't see with our eyes, called hell beings, spirits, God, so many other beings, all of whom are called mind possessors. And all, for Buddha, possess Buddha nature. It's a term they use. We all possess the potential, very simply, to rid the mind utterly of all the rubbish, all the ego and the fears and the nonsense and the anger and the jealousy and the depression and the dramas of daily life that we in our materialist views assume are normal, but which for Buddha are deep mental illnesses. But amazingly, what Buddha has found from his own experience, that these are not necessary. We can rid the mind of them utterly, which is kind of a shocking, radical concept, because if you think in the Western terms, we don't think this way. You know, you go to some of you who might be a therapist, I might ask you to please give me methods to get rid of all ego, all fears, all jealousy, all attachment, all anger, and to have infinite love and bliss and clarity and goodness and compassion for all sentient beings. You'll think I'm seriously mentally ill. Not kidding, honestly, because it does not exist in our world. But that's essentially, in most simple terms, what Buddha's saying, what Buddha has found himself from his own experience. So a word for this is called Buddha. So the Tibetan word is very interesting. The Tibetan word for Buddha, which is Sanskrit, Sangye, the first syllable implies the complete eradication from the mind of all neuroses, all the stuff that we think is so normal. And then the second syllable, Ge, implies the complete development of all the goodness. It's the simplest way of putting it. I mean, the level to which we can rid the mind of the badness and develop the goodness is far more radical than we would ever think. You know, and we'll see how we go over the weekend discussing all this. But this is essentially what Buddha's saying. This is the Mahayana view. That every sentient being possesses naturally, just by being a mind possessor, each mind possesses this potential naturally. So all of Buddha's teachings are simply the methods of how to accomplish that goal. To rid the mind of all the rubbish and fully develop all the goodness. A simple way of putting it. So Buddha's model of the mind is kind of deceptively simple. But it goes, as I said, to extraordinary subtle levels, you know, of clarity and understanding, and then of course experiential, to become experientially in touch with all this, not enough to be intellectual. So basically, the mind for the Buddha, even his view of what the mind is radically different from how we think. You know, first he says it's not the brain, it's not physical. He's not saying the brain doesn't play a very vivid role. It's obvious, but for him, mind is not the brain. He doesn't use the word spirit or soul, not like that at all. he would say the mind is non-physical. The word's used in a much more subjective way. It's often used synonymously with the word consciousness. And it's not used as sort of implying some kind of box up here that you've got to delve into, or, things like this. But it's a very subjectively used word, one's own consciousness, one's own thoughts, feelings, emotions, unconscious, instinct, intuition, the entire spectrum of our inner being. That's our mind for the Buddha. And that, as Lama Zopa puts it, that's where the workshop is. This is what we need to learn to deeply understand, because this is what we're trying to radically reconfigure, completely change. This is Buddha's view, So your mind is not physical, first. Second, it's not given to you by someone else. And this is kind of a shock. Whether you're a materialist or a Christian or a Muslim, they at least all agree that someone else gave you a mind. God created you, gave you a soul. If you're a materialist, mummy and daddy created us. Effectively, that's what we're saying. Buddha disagrees with this. His view is quite different. He says we don't need to be given a mind by anybody else. We don't need a creator. It's an unnecessary embellishment. Mummy and daddy definitely play a role. They give me a body. They give me a brain. But that's not my mind for the Buddha. And a superior being, Buddha doesn't, he uses the term superior being, interestingly, but he doesn't talk about a creator. No concept like that. Our who we are then, parents give us the body, but the mind, the Buddha says, which is not physical, is one's own. So basically the simplest point is, it doesn't come from a creator, doesn't come from mummy or daddy at the time of conception, it comes from previous moments of itself. The best way to think of it in Buddhist terms is like a river of mental moments. This moment comes necessarily from the previous moment, and if we had perfect memory, we know very well we could remember every second of our conscious experiences between now and 24 hours ago, and you keep going back. You've got to get back to the first second of conception, and the Buddha says you track back the previous second to this continuity of mind, which is not physical, which goes also, the other difference is the mind goes to far more subtle, more refined levels of cognition, not just the gross levels that we function at day to day through the medium of the brain and the body. Far more subtle. And this is the Hindus finding, this in their view of mind and their pursuit of the nature of self, their discovery, they're creating basically this extraordinary meditation technique, known broadly now as mindfulness, but actually it's not the most accurate word for the technique. It's actually called single-pointed concentration, and a person who accomplishes this to the degree that one can, if you were to see them in this state, they would look like they were dead. Their consciousness has gone to subtler levels, but not in a mystical sense. One is super conscious at this level. This indeed does come from the Hindus, but it's the crucial tool that Buddha uses, and that one as a Buddhist needs to use in the long term to get to the subtler levels of our own mind in order to do this job of unraveling and unpacking and ridding the mind of the rubbish and growing the goodness in the long term, So your mind is not physical, does not come from a creator, does not come from parents. It's its own continuity. It goes back and back and back. And essentially the point that Buddha is making is that what's in the mind, the contents of it, therefore, the love, the kindness, the intelligence, the goodness, the hate, the psychosis, the lust, the being good at football, being good at music, whatever it might be, they're a bunch of tendencies. And where they come from? Well, baby, you brought them with you from before. What I have in my mind now comes from yesterday. That came from before, which came from the day before, which came from the day before. And you get back to the first second of conception, Buddha would say, already you came into that mother's womb fully programmed with all these tendencies. They're your tendencies. Hitler's mummy is not the cause of Hitler. Not for the Buddha. This little old Austrian housewife, Nor is, Mother Teresa's mummy the cause of Mother Teresa. We bring our own stuff with us. This is a fundamental point in Buddha's view. Clearly we can't prove it immediately, but we can take it as a hypothesis, not too complicated. And this is a crucial point in order to really get our head around the big picture in Buddhism, So anyway, in terms of the psychological model of the mind, let's look at this now, because this is going to help us understand this view that Buddha has, that's his very specific view, that suffering comes from the neuroses in our mind. But he has found, and the term they use, we don't use it perhaps in our daily life, certainly one doesn't use this particular word, adventitious, in our daily life. You can look up your dictionary for this. Buddha's found that the delusions, like I said, the neuroses are adventitious. They are not at the core of our being, therefore can be removed. This is fundamentally Buddha's long-term finding. This is the meaning of the word nirvana. You've achieved your nirvana when you've rid the mind of the rubbish, you know. This is the point that he's found. This is his unique point. So to really get our head around that, even intellectually, we have to understand these neuroses. And as for the Buddha, they have two main characteristics. One is, and this is indicated by one of the many terms, the synonyms in Buddhism for these neuroses. Now, he would have liked that word, I think, neuroses. You know, they didn't speak Greek back then. That's why they didn't have the word psychology. I mean, we've just taken from the Greeks, haven't we? But basically, they have these characteristics of being deeply disturbing and delusional. Disturbing and delusional. These are the two key characteristics of these unhappy states of mind that we have. So check the last time you were jealous, angry, depressed. We know it was disturbing. No one has to point that out. It's unbearable, you know. And the other one, though, that's the trick. This is the one, if we can understand this other characteristic of these neuroses, we are really on track in understanding this amazing point that Buddha's making, that we're not in touch with reality. And that when we can understand that, we can understand how we can get to understand emptiness, which is when we are in touch with reality. This is how Buddha's talking, you know. So this characteristic of these neuroses, these unhappy states of mind, these disturbing emotions, being delusional, it demands that we understand that they're conceptual states of mind. And this is such a shock. Check the last time you see a person raging with anger. And then, you know, and you think, well, that's interesting. They've got these really elaborate conceptual stories in their head, you know. We don't think that. We just call it emotion. And then you see the evidence, the spit coming out the mouth. If they're a white person, you know, bright red in their face, eyes bulging, insane, irrational words vomiting out the mouth. I mean, they're basically having a mental breakdown, isn't it? But we just go, oh, they're just angry. And they'll get over it and become normal again. But we know very well a person continues like that every day. That's when we call it mentally ill. Well, it is mental illness. Actually, it's kind of a surprising way to put it, kind of sobering. So we can see ourselves when we're really depressed. We're very jealous, very angry, extremely attached to something. We can see there's this characteristic there of distorting, exaggerating. Our mothers tell us, did I tell you in Swedish, that we make mountains out of molehills. Did your mother tell you that in Swedish? You haven't got that one?
Yeah. What is it?
Make a mountain out of a molehill. A molehill is a little baby, little kind of, a mole makes a little hill. So we think it's, when the mind is angry, really, we can see it. When you're extreme emotion, it seems like a mountain to you. And when you calm down, you realize, you know, it wasn't so bad after all. Sometimes, you understand? Make a mountain out of a molehill. It works in English, doesn't it? So it's very hard to see this because it's so natural to us. And these deluded states of mind, Buddha says, they run the show right now. You know, they completely are present in our mind much of the time. And we can see how easy they are. You know, we hear about, okay, in the Buddhist model, we've got, simply speaking, there are three categories of states of mind. There's no fourth category in this model. And they seem deceptively simple. One, there's called negative states of mind, positive states of mind, and there's a third category called neutral, which doesn't mean they're not important, but they lack these particular characteristics of the virtuous and the non-virtuous ones, the negative and the positive. So, you know, for the Buddha, then, the virtuous or positive states of mind, we all know them. Love, empathy, compassion, generosity, forgiveness. These words, instantly we hear them, we know they're the good things. And we know perfectly well when they are prevalent in our own mind or prevalent in our relationships, everything works beautifully. We know this, you know. But then the second you have the other ones, we know there's chaos. A lot of grasping and attachment, anger, depression, jealousy, low self-esteem, aggression, you know, arrogance. There's just a half a dozen. And they're the ones we all can see, you know. We can see these immediately. We recognize them immediately in ourselves. So, of course, in our materialist models, these are normal. We're all born this way. So we tend to accept they're normal. And like I said before, there's no radical view at all that says you can get rid of... You need a cushion. You got a cushion?
Yes, I got a cushion.
Oh, darling. It's not very comfy, though.
That's okay. I'll settle it.
Okay, good. All right. She has optimism. Good. So this is, so okay. There's a hierarchy in these negative states of mind. There's like a hierarchy of how, the way they relate to each other. It's very clear. So there's one, and this is where we begin to look into the way we finally rid the mind of all the rubbish. To understand the root delusion. In Buddhist psychology, they refer to it as the root delusion, the root neurosis, the mother of them all, the source of all the others in this hierarchy. And it's known simply in Tibetan as ma-ripa, unawareness, or in English, ignorance. But it's got a very specific use, this word ignorance. These words are very common to us, but we need to be very specific in our definitions. So this ignorance, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, is, it's not just like regular ignorance. If regular ignorance, if you say to me, Robina, what's that? And if I don't know, I'll simply say, I don't know. Well, that's really straightforward ignorance, isn't it? And you can fix it in 1 second. You can tell me it's a glass. And within a minute, I'll understand it. So if our ignorance that Buddha talks about, this maripa, which is the root delusion, the cause of all suffering, if it was simply not knowing how things exist, we could become enlightened in a couple of years. But it's not like that. It's kind of like double trouble. As His Holiness says, not only does this ignorance in our mind completely not know how everything exists, the self and the entire universe, in particular, doesn't understand interdependence and emptiness. He says not only that, but it's made up its own ridiculous story. It's made up the story that's the direct opposite of reality. And he says for eons, the Buddha says for eons, we've been believing in that story that our ignorance has made up. So it's like ripping off your skin to start to change that view, because we are very, very deeply attached to our wrong view of how things exist. This is the way Buddhist psychology talks, And it's not how we talk in the Western world, so we've got to get our head around this if we want to really go into Buddhism in more depth and try and get a sense of what he's really talking about. Because it's not abstract, but it can sound abstract if we don't get the right use of the words, So then this root, we'll go into this more, but this root delusion, ignorance, is often known, this is the colloquial term for it, which is very tasty, is ego grasping. It's got this very powerful characteristic of intense, panic-stricken grasping. And it's, most of the day, it's like a sleeping lion. But as soon as someone attacks us, offends us, insults us, then it wakes up. And its function, its function is to grasp intensely. And what it grasps at, the main one, is the self. So basically, it's made up, Buddha says, it's made up a fantasy of the self. We don't think this. And understanding this, which we're going to unpack in the weekend, understanding this is really helping us understand Buddha's whole deal, So this ego grasping, this primordial root delusion that clings frantically to this unhappy, fear-based, separate, lonely, bereft, neurotic sense of self, instinctively believing is stuck in stone and permanent and inherent, all these words which we'll unpack. Then it gives, and this running the show, it's right down, deepest, the deepest, and it's in the minds of all beings. So what then, the main voice, if you like, of this ego grasping is the state of mind called attachment. Such a simple word. As Lama Yeshe says, I could tell you about attachment for one whole year. We will never begin to understand it until we go, understand it and go deep inside to really investigate the workings of it, It's multifaceted. So the main voice of this ego grasping is this frantic, desperate, every second, desperate need, frantic, grasping, neediness to get what that I wants. The I we've made up. So, and then the millisecond attachment doesn't get what it wants, that gives rise to anger. So we're going like between this attachment and anger, or the bare bones state of mind beneath what we call anger is called aversion. So when attachment is there, one of its characteristics is kind of this constant, desperate need to get what I want every millisecond. It's desperate, and it only wants the nice things. So the second it doesn't get the nice things, it turns into aversion. So, you know, you're driving along the road, you don't think you're attached to anything, you just think you're driving on the road, and then suddenly a car jumps in front of you. Well, the I rises like a sleeping lion, and then instantly, because attachment didn't get what it wanted, which was to drive undisturbed, then how dare you do that to me, we will say, and then the heart will beat, you know. We just think that's normal. Well, Buddha says it's mental illness. It sounds so peculiar to think this. It's just normal behavior, you know. We think fear is a normal behavior. Well, for the Buddha, fear is a function of all these neuroses. As Lama Zopa says, when you have realized emptiness, there is no fear. Now that's an outrageous idea, you know. So this ego grasping is the root delusion. It's there all the time. It gives rise to the main one effectively in day-to-day life, called this bottomless pit of craving, attachment, desperate, frantic need to get what I want every millisecond. The second it doesn't, and that's 1,000 times a day. It's not possible to give attachment what it wants. It's not possible, you know. So the second it doesn't get what it wants, anything from just the annoyed, you know, look at all the words. Annoyed, upset, irritated, stressed. These are all variations of aversion. When it's expressed strongly, it's called anger, you know. Or if it goes internally, it's called depression, which is kind of very curious, very interesting. We'll unpack this. So we're going between attachment, the default mode, the default assumption that we don't even question, you know, is that I should get what I want. It's just an assumption in our mind. That's what irritation is. Even just drop the cup, you get annoyed with yourself. It's natural because, you know, you're going to the sink, between here and the sink, you don't expect to drop something, and how annoying you drop something. That's called aversion, because attachment just didn't get what it wanted. As simple as that. You meet the red light instead of the green light. Not to mention your husband leaving you for the younger version. Which is even more distressing, more pain. So it's a question of degree. But these attachment and aversion, really, this is almost like saying what Buddha means by samsara. They sound so simple to us. And of course, we don't notice them until it's very big. Then we have to go to the therapist, you know, and try and, you know, calm it all down. But the thing is, the Buddha's saying one of the reasons we need to develop this simple skill of, as we call it, mindful, being aware of what is going on in here, well before it comes out the mouth, well before you can't get out of bed one morning, well before you need to go to a therapist. This incredible awareness we must develop, because what goes on in here, Buddha says, is the source, not out there. So we have to learn to be aware of this mind of ours. So this ego grasping gives rise to massive attachment, which gives rise to anger, aversion, you know, these things. But then the other variations come from there. The arrogance and the jealousy and the depression and all this business, you know. I mean, there are many, many states of mind in there. In Buddhist psychology, there are thousands of states of mind. But we can narrow it down to these half a dozen. And then we're all basically variations of this recipe. You know, there's a person with, we've all got ego grasping. As long as you're in samsara, you've got this ego grasping. Join the club, people. As long as there's ego grasping, there's going to be attachment to get what it wants. As long as there's attachment to get what it wants, there's going to be aversion when it doesn't. Some people have lots of anger. We can see this. So they get angry very easily. The second attachment doesn't get. Some people take less time, take more, don't get so angry, you know. Some people goes internally, get despairing and depressed and hopeless, which is internalized aversion. And these things, they work so subtly, you know. And we only can begin to see them if we take this particular view that Buddha has, the way these states of mind work. Not the physical, not the brain, not the chemicals, not the external, not what mummy did, not what daddy did, not the red light, not the hubby. They're the external things, which is what we spend all our time on. But the Buddha's view is you spend time looking at the mind itself. And this really takes time. Sounds so simple, but it's quite radical, the difference. So, you know, okay. So learning to become in touch with our own mind. So what I'm getting at here is we're trying to understand how Buddha says, why he says that we suffer because we're not in touch with reality. This is what he's essentially saying. So that means we have to try and understand how all these neuroses, which indeed are deeply disturbing, pretty evident, that characteristic, but we need to try and understand how they're liars, how they're deceptive, how they're delusional, how they're conceptual stories that aren't accurate. It's the way to say it, you know. But we don't see this because mostly we just feel the feeling. We're so involved in the emotion. If you have lots of jealousy, all you feel is this despair and the deep feeling of it all, the physical feeling of it all. To hear that this is an elaborate conceptual story that's exaggerating the truth It seems bizarre to us, you know. But this is what Buddha's saying. This is his unique approach. Anger for, you know, attachment. Okay, the bottom line, the day-to-day one. So they all have this particular characteristic, like I'm saying, of distorting reality. I think it's not too difficult to prove, you know. If I'm really attached to chocolate cake, let's just say, we all know. You just put your object there. It mightn't be chocolate cake. It could be anything, you know. We all know this one. And this is one of the functions of this state of mind, attachment. One of its key functions is it makes the object look a lot more delicious than it really is. Now, we know that. You know, when I'm in love with Fred, you know, he will look like the most divine thing, isn't it? Since you can't imagine. Unbelievable, like blissful. This person from his head to his toenails. We know this experience. But we kind of take it for granted. We think it's normal. And because it seems so delicious, you know, and there are delicious consequences of it, which hide us from seeing the very undelicious consequences of it, the suffering it causes. So anyway, the point is here, we can see when you're overly needy for something, overly craving something, grasping at something, attached to something, one of the key things is the object looks more delicious. Obvious, the chocolate cake. And it all happens so spontaneously. We're not analysing it like this. This is so spontaneous in us. So then what happens, we know, because the cake looks more delicious than it really is, and the more hungry you are for it, the more divine it looks, but also the more you will then believe, the attachment will exaggerate the role that cake plays in your happiness. The belief totally is when I get the cake, I'll get happy. We know that. Certainly with Fred, there's no question, you know. And we make up all these stories. We're like writing novels in our head. But we don't notice these things. So it's this one of seeing how they're distortions, seeing how they're delusions, isn't that easy to see? We can hear it, you know, but it's not that easy to see. But this is the crucial one we need to understand if we're trying to work with Buddhist psychology in our lives, and that's our decision. We don't have to. And if we really want to begin to understand emptiness. If we can't understand this particular characteristic that all the neuroses have of being distorted, delusional exaggerations of the truth, then we won't ever be able to understand emptiness, you know. So then if attachment exaggerates the delicious aspects of something, then look what arises after you've had 5 pieces of chocolate cake. We know perfectly well now, you look at that same cake, it's not even got cold yet. We know this. It now looks repulsive, doesn't it? That's aversion. So aversion is the consequence of attachment. Either, you know, so the belief of attachment 100% is it's so divine, so delicious, and then when I get it, it'll give me happiness, and you taste it, and it really does taste delicious. But you keep eating it because you keep not getting satisfied yet until eventually you can't eat more, you'd vomit. We know this. We know this experience. It's the same with Fred. Might take a few more, you know, might take a few mouthfuls, might take a few months or even years. But if attachment is all the time needy and expecting something and dumping on Fred this expectation that he'd better make me happy, he'd better fulfill my attachment fantasy of him, which is very cruel to do to people. Chocolate cake doesn't mind, you know? But to put this incredible over-exaggerated expectation on Fred, who looks totally divine to you, whom you just expect will fulfill your needs. And then when he doesn't, look what happens. You get annoyed, irritated, upset, angry, and then it increases, and then 6 months later, you can't believe this disgusting person in your bed. And you leave him for a younger version. I mean, or kill him, whichever happens first, unfortunately. I mean, it's not funny, but it's funny, you know. But we can see that this stuff, because these emotions are so normal, we never look at them in this particular way. This is Buddha's way of looking at them, that they're distorted habits in the mind. But because we can't imagine not having them, kind of we just go blank, you know, what's the honor? And that's why when we think of giving up attachment and giving up anger and giving up jealousy, the best we can come up with is that we end up with nothing. Kind of like this flatlining, you know, nothing. Not like that at all. But it's really hard to hear this because it's not the way we think in our culture. Because in our culture, we assume, all our models of the mind assume what the Buddha would call these deep, distorted, delusion, mental illnesses. We consider them normal. So we know very well that we'd like to lessen the attachment and the anger and the jealousy. That seems reasonable. But to rid the mind utterly of them, that seems bizarre, you know. But this is precisely what Buddha's saying. So don't just to believe it doesn't help. To really unpack all this stuff and try and hear logically what he's saying, at least intellectually, is very helpful. Gives some kind of confidence in the methods, you know. Not just, oh yeah, nirvana, blah, blah, you know, not like that. So the key is, of all these neuroses, they have this deeply disturbing characteristic. That's pretty easy to prove. But they're liars, they're misconceptions, and that's the point that he's saying. As we begin to know our minds more, as we learn these meditation techniques, we develop this mindfulness business, we start to focus more, we can step back out of the mess, you know, so we can begin to hear these thousands of thoughts every single second, isn't it? Since we wake up until we go to sleep, the mind never stops in all these dramas, thoughts inside there, stories, you know. So we have to begin to unpack and unravel these and begin to identify all the different ones. It's really quite subtle. There's so many. It's like a big soup in there. We can see it. And then at least to begin to identify, there's the anger story, there's the jealousy story, there's the depressed story, there's this one, there's that one. And to begin to distinguish between those, which are the cause of all the pain for the Buddha, and the virtuous ones, the good ones, the love, the kindness, the compassion. So if I'm in love with Fred, for example, you know, there's two things going on, simple, thousands, but essentially two. One is attachment and one is love. Well, love is under the positive heading. Love is an altruistic state of mind. Love is a virtue. Love is a positive state of mind. And these are not moralistic terms. These are technical terms in Buddhist psychology. So love, we need to grow this more. And love for the Buddha is, relatively speaking, related to reality. And we'll go into this more. So love is defined as like an affection for Fred. May you be happy. The thought, may you be happy. That's the definition of love. I have compassion for Fred when he suffers, and that's defined as may you not suffer. So I do have love for Fred. I do have compassion for Fred. There's no question. But it's completely polluted by my attachment, which is totally I-based. The virtues are connected to others. They're interconnected. But delusions are totally frantic, ego-grasping based. They're I-based. They're separate, they're lonely, they're bereft, they're needy, they distort. If we would experience mainly only attachment on its own, or mainly only anger, we would be monsters, you know. We can see some people this way. But our love at the moment is, we have love. I do want Fred to be happy, but it's polluted by attachment. And so when there are problems with Fred, it's not because I love Fred. It's because I'm attached to Fred. I'm needy for Fred to do what I want. I have distorted views about him, my expectations, my possessiveness. All these are characteristics of this attachment, you know. Very hard to see. And they're all conceptual elaborations. This is what's so hard to see. It just takes time, you know, to go into our minds in this way. And this is a crucial difference. I mean, Lama Yeshe would often say we need to learn to be our own therapist. It sounds kind of cute, but it's profoundly true. And it's very particular, the way Buddha says we need to know about our mind. So if I go to one of you, as my therapist, let's say, because the models of the mind in our culture mostly assume mummy and daddy made us, assume the mind is the brain, assume that I'm mainly the product of my own neuro business and my chemicals and my DNA and my genes and so on and so forth. In other words, the physical. And then also that I'm a product of events. Then of course that's where we look, don't we? We look back into the events, what mummy did, what daddy did, what the Catholic nuns did, my genes, my DNA, my grandpa, etc. Because that's the main source of Robina. So that's where we look. Well, Buddha's not arguing that you shouldn't. He says nothing wrong, but you won't get to the source of it. The source of it's not there, he says. The source of it's in here. So it's almost so simple, but we can't hear it. You know, when I talk about to you my jealousy when Fred keeps looking at the other girls, you know, we're going to look back into why I developed this habit of being jealous. Or if I'm always very feeling he's abandoning me, this abandonment issues we talk about, you know. We'll always look at, well, what happened when you're a little girl? And what happened when daddy do and mummy do? That's fine, but Buddha says you won't get to the source of it. The source of it is my habit to be jealous. The main cause of my jealousy is my tendency to be jealous. And why do I have a tendency to be jealous? Because guess what? I was jealous yesterday. Well, then what was the reason I was jealous yesterday? Well, guess what? Because I was jealous the day before. And where'd that come from? Well, that was coming from the jealousy of the day before. And you get going right back. You're going to get back to the first second of conception, where Buddha says, I came fully programmed with all my tendencies in my mind before I get anywhere near Fred. So I have a tendency to be jealous. I've got the tendency to kill. I've got the tendency to lie, or indeed be loving or generous or kind. So this is the Buddha's view. You look into the mind itself. Yes, Fred might be looking at other girls. Yes, that person might have harmed me. But that's not the thing to look at, not for the Buddha. You look at the states of mind themselves. It's almost so simple, but it's too hard for us to hear because we just don't have a view like this. And that means we have to begin to identify the conceptual story that jealousy is speaking. To unpack the story and then recognize it's dependent upon a certain view here, and that's based on the underpinning of this, and that comes from attachment, which comes from this, which comes from ego grasping in this hierarchy, you know. So you unpack these conceptual stories, looking at the assumptions of each one. It's a very particular way of looking at the mind, you know. Not just feeling the feeling, not just knowing I'm feeling something, not just remembering what people did. This can be helpful, but they're just indicators. They're not the actual event for the Buddha. The event itself is those very states of mind. And so being your own therapist is based on understanding this model, that they're all conceptual stories, deeply ingrained habits that I brought with me from countless past lives, Buddha says, not from mummy and daddy. They might share them because they've done them before as well. So this is the particular approach of knowing your mind in the Buddha's view, you know. And this gets us then to really, as we begin to see how jealousy is an exaggeration and a distortion, it might have some truth in it, that anger is a distortion, that attachment is a distortion, they're all deluded, distorted, exaggerated assessments of reality. And in that sense, they're not accurate. So they get to the root of this ego grasping, which is the one that informs all the others. And so this is where the emptiness teachings come in, getting to the root, understanding the root, you know. Are we communicating here? Yes. Any questions, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, where are you?
Isn't anger originating from
I can't quite hear.
Isn't anger originating from fear?
I didn't hear the last part of your sentence.
Anger. Doesn't anger come from fear?
Okay, this is a very interesting point. In Buddhist psychology, they don't speak it like this, but this is us in the West where fear plays a massive role. But this is my way of saying it. If one notices in Buddhist psychology, fear is not given its own status as a state of mind, because all the delusions are rooted in fear. Ego grasping is the main one. The word we use in the West, I think this would be the best equivalent that we would have in the West, in modern scientific language, that would be equivalent to this view of the Buddha about ego grasping, this grasping at a self. It's the one we call instinct for survival. We see in the scientific terms that you have to have this to survive. When you're attacked, that's what caused you to do this and stop drowning and, you know, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's what, you know, look at when we are attacked. You're nearly driven over by the car. Someone nearly attacks you. Look at the complete paralysis of fear, isn't it? People lose all common sense. That fear, if we, like your point, so it's not even so much that anger comes from fear, but anger is that fear is in the nature of all the delusions. Look at a person who's angry. They are having a panic attack, like freaking out because they just can't bear that thing that's about to happen. It's like total fear. It's not even as if it's coming from fear. It is in the nature of fear. Look at when you're really attached to something. I'm not trying to be too personal here, but I remember when I was in love with people, when I was into boys, you know. And I remember, because I've got such an obsessive mind, you know, so intense, as you can see. I'm trying to use it for being a good person now. But anyway, I know when I was completely obsessed with a person, I can see why people would kill if they couldn't get the object of their attachment, you know. When I was completely obsessed with a person, just the thought of not seeing them that day, you almost went mad, you know. Because attachment, anger, jealousy, pride are all rooted in this ego grasping, which is the primordial one, which we very rarely even give a name to, but that's the arising of this sense of a self. And these are all these defenses of this self. The craving to get what the self wants. The panic attack when its self doesn't get what it wants, which is anger. Then the jealousy. They're all variations, and they are in the nature of fear. And as once we've rid the mind of these and eventually realized emptiness and perfected that, as Lama Zopa says, literally, there is no fear. Literally, there is no fear. This is bizarre to us. We can't conceive of this, you know. Do you see my point? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you in relation to love, right?
Love meaning Buddha's view, or love in general, the way we mean it?
In the naughty term you mean.
Oh, you mean attachment?
No, well, I'll get there now.
Okay, darling.
Okay, this is my lovely wife, right? Obviously, an aspect of what I feel for her is going to be based on my visual opinion of her, my
That's right.
visual attraction to her.
That's right.
How do you suggest you create a healthy balance between that
Yeah.
and the physical
I understand,
aspect?
darling, totally.
The physical aspect has a root in some type of attachment.
No, I understand, of
desire.
course. First of all, the bare bones function of attachment, as I said, is that it will make the object look very delicious to us. So we can see some advantage in that, can't we? Isn't it?
Yeah.
If we're in a world where we have wives and husbands and people and cakes, and so, you know, when I see my Vegemite, I'm attached to my Vegemite, you know. It looks more delicious than saying Marmite. If you're English, don't worry about it. So the point, okay, the big picture, Buddha's big picture, he would call this universe we occupy, which is the universe of lots of different individual separate people, he calls it a desire realm. And desire is an equivalent of the word attachment. So it is what drives us completely. It is what drives us. This body got the five senses, which in their nature crave objects. It's the way the world is. So as a Buddhist, or a person who wants to use these tools, what we will attempt to do is identify, to try to isolate, first theoretically and then experientially, this attachment. Knowing we've all got it, join the club, it's okay, you know, and then begin to see the downside of it, the causes, the suffering side of it. So the one side of it, okay, let me give you an example. There's always this example of a friend of mine whose boy was a fisherman, okay? And since a little boy, as soon as he saw fishing, basically he fell in love with fishing. You know, we see this. You fall in love with a girl, you fall in love with fishing, you fall in love with the cake, whatever the event is or the thing, it's like that. It's basically like that. So that's the Buddhist view would be, because he had a tendency in his mind from past habit to kill. So what happens is, he's a little boy, he sees fishing, and the first time he sees it, you know, he doesn't know he's been a past person, he doesn't think like this. All he knows is it looks extremely delicious to him. So that's what, you know, whether you know, you hear about people who, when they go, first time they go to the football, they know they're going to be a footballer. The first time they see Mary, they know they're going to marry her, like Romeo and Juliet, you know? They completely know that they're meant for each other. So that's not just people. That's like events. Torturers are attached. They get pleasure from torturing. It sounds peculiar to us. This is the way attachment works. So you can see the downside of attachment when it comes to something like being attached to fishing, because fishing hurts sentient beings. You with me so far? So this attachment in his mind it does various things. It makes the event or the object, in this case fishing, for you it's in your case wife, right? You're nice. What's your name? What's your wife's name and yours?
Adam and Shirley.
Shirley, and who are you?
Adam.
Adam and Shirley. Okay, right. Okay. So there's Adam and Shirley. They didn't know each other at some point. And like Romeo and Juliet, when you first see each other, it's like, you know, do you see West Side Story? You know, and Tony and Maria see each other. Everything else disappears. Because Buddha would say karma ripens between you and Shirley. You've got some history from the past lives. This is what they would say. And you see each other again. It's like you recognize, you know. So she appears divine to you. So then this boy, the same with fishing. So when it comes to Shirley, it's hard to see how attachment can cause suffering. But I'll get there. But with the fishing one, it's evident. So there's this boy. He sees fishing. The habit is there. It triggers that habit. Then because it's familiar with him, he's got this instinct to do it, he's got history with it, it makes it look extremely delicious. The whole thing looks so divine. So naturally, what looks delicious, this is the part, it triggers a good feeling in the body. Now you know all about those when it comes to Shirley's. These ones are easy to see. You understand my point. But with the fishing one, it triggered a good feeling. So logically, because we're all junkies for good feelings, we want good feelings, don't we? That's what we call happiness. So the logical deduction in his mind is, oh, I've got a good feeling. Fishing looks good. It must be good, so I'll keep fishing. But the tragedy is with fishing, all the years he did fishing, His mother could never bear it, but she was always very polite because her boy, and she tried to give him respect. You know, she didn't like fishing. When she saw fishing, it did not look delicious. She didn't have a habit to kill. But so she went fishing with him one time, she said, and this is the point I'm getting to. She found it unbearable because she didn't have attachment to fishing. Therefore, she didn't exaggerate the deliciousness of it. He did. Because of this, she saw straight away that fish weren't happy. It was evident to her that they were suffering. It was evident they didn't like it. It was evident they'd rather be in the water, please. But he was a professional fisherman. He had hundreds of thousands of flapping fish in his boat, but he could never see their suffering because all he saw was the story his attachment made up. Are you seeing what I'm saying? So you know when we fall in love, let's say Shirley turns out to be some kind of really horrible person. This happens all the time. People marry rapists and liars and cheats and thieves, and then we're so shocked. Then you leave Shirley because you can't believe that how dare she do that to me? But she was always like that. How come you didn't notice? Because you were blinded. You were kind of blinded by the deliciousness, and that's the downside of attachment. You see what I'm saying? But also that's not the only downside. Especially when we're very attached to somebody that also, first they look gorgeous, which is very helpful, but we also then we have an expectation that she must fulfill those cravings of yours. And so one day when she doesn't, then you start to get angry. And that's why, I'm not trying to be stupid here or even go against men or anything, but I remember reading the World Health Organization numbers. 40% of all female people on this earth who die, who get murdered, you know who murders them? The person in the same bed. This is not meant to be against men. This is the downside of attachment. So they began in a gorgeous relationship, and they're both needy little people. I'm attached to you, and you're attached to me, and I expect you to make me happy, and you expect me to make you happy, and then I get angry when you don't do it, then I get jealous. I mean, have you noticed people fight in relationships? The Buddha would say that's because of attachment. The attachment is at the root, but it's a honey-covered razor blade. You can't see it. So if there's not so much neediness aspect of attachment, Shirley could still look divine to you. How marvelous. But the neediness part is the part to work on. And then when she doesn't do what you want every time, you practice patience and kindness and forgiveness. And then 20 years later, when she's fat and old, you still adore her. It won't matter because you love her now because your love overrides the attachment. You kind of see what I'm saying? So it's not an easy job because they come so together,
So work more on the positive aspects.
Try to grow the positive, absolutely. Because every time, when Shirley doesn't do what your attachment wants, she might, make a smell in the bathroom. When you're in love with a person, we don't mind, but after a while, it gets a bit annoying, Or when she doesn't come home on time, or when she doesn't, she doesn't hear you properly. If you come home irritated, we know these little baby things, they get upset. Upset is called anger. It's a polite word for anger because the person didn't do what my attachment wanted. So to see this and to recognize this neediness to get what I want every second, do you understand? It's not an easy job, but this is the work. And then consciously practicing patience, practicing forgiveness, practicing love instead. And this is what practice is basically every day. You with me, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yes.
If you consider all these characteristics to be with us from long ago,
That Buddha would say that.
how could we help ourselves to be a beautiful-minded person in our practical life?
Because luckily we all have those as well. That's how come we're sitting in this room here. And how come we're not in the gun club or in the pub blind drunk? Because we also have wisdom. We've practiced wisdom. We've practiced clarity. We've practiced the wish to become better people. That's how come we're sitting in this place right now, because that is also strong. Aren't we fortunate? So we use those ones to get stronger. We build those parts of us. We weaken the one lot of muscles and we grow the other muscles. That's how you turn yourself into a better person, You with me? It's hard work, that's all. But we've got to first begin to unpack the mess, this big soup of emotion to try to sort out which one is which, because they just come flooding into us so spontaneously. So it's hard work. You're looking downfall. Does it make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I have one question.
Yes, darling.
I would like to understand so much about the sensorial.
The which one?
Sensorial.
The senses.
Sensorial aspects of life.
Yes. That's an interesting point, the sensory. Well, as I'm saying, Buddha's...
Robina, maybe we just repeat the question so everybody hears it.
Okay. What's your name?
Celeste.
Celeste wants to know about the sensory, the understanding the way the senses, the sensory aspect of our life. Yes? Okay, that's a very interesting point. As I said, Buddha says we are in a desire realm, meaning we're basically this embodied bunch of senses, aren't we? There's a mind in here where mind possesses, and we have this body with the 5 senses. And so we can see they play a massive role in our lives, and attachment is the main energy that feeds those senses. Because we can see some people have attachment to things that go through the mouth here. Some people have attachment to other, other objects that go into other holes. Excuse me, I'm getting very gross. I can't help, I get very gross with my words. Excuse me, I won't get gross. I mean, okay. Well, let me just describe kind of interestingly. In Buddhist psychology, one of the ways of describing the mind is we break it down into 2 main ways of functioning. First, before we were discussing the mental consciousness. But let's look at, we've got sensory consciousness. Okay. So, I might go, well, I haven't really got a pretty cup there, but never mind. What have I got that's pretty? I haven't got anything pretty. Let's just say this one. Okay. When I look at this bowl, I might go, oh, what a pretty cup. A pretty bowl, okay? Now, actually, what we're thinking is that my eyes are seeing a pretty bowl. But that's clearly nonsense for the Buddha. As far as the Buddha is concerned, the senses, the sensory consciousness, which to be really precise about it, is that part of our mind, not physical, remember, that functions through the medium of the eyeball, the ear, the skin, etc., etc., is really very limited, profoundly limited in its capacity for cognition. So technically your eye consciousness does not see a pretty bowl. My eye consciousness does not, Adam's eye consciousness does not see beautiful Shirley. He thinks he does. Because when he looks at Shirley, she looks so blissful. We know this, and we know it. Looks so blissful to him. Because because we are sensory, it's the only way we can actually communicate with other beings, through the senses, isn't it? We don't have that much kind of mental awareness of things. We can develop that, become more intuitive to each other. This is true. But we rely, the senses are the doorway for our world, and they mislead us hugely. So if Adam, likes girls, he's got no common sense. We know that. If he's looking only at the visual, which is what some people do. They only like the visual. So he's going to be really conned by really naughty people who are going to completely rip him off and do this, like I said before. But he's as blind as a bat because he's overrun. He's driven by his craving for pretty visual objects, So he can't see the person. He can't notice the other qualities. So the senses, so what's happening is eye consciousness sees this shape and colour, and I swear to you, because we're so trained in this, Buddha says for countless lives, within a millisecond, quicker than Google, and I'm not joking, this will trigger my mental consciousness, and that's where the memory is. That's where all the workshop is. That's where all the labels are. So within a millisecond, in my mental consciousness, label bowl will come up, label blue, the memory of all the things that I have decided that I like artistically. All this comes in a millisecond, and I will say, what a pretty bowl. But my eye consciousness does not see that. It sees 2 things, shape and colour. When Adam's eyes look on Shirley, all he sees is shape and colour. The rest of it is a story in his mental consciousness because of past karma, because of his own taste, and a million other things. When he says Shirley's this and Shirley's that. Can you kind of hear what I'm saying? It's very sobering, actually. And so the senses, as Lama Yeshe says, we make the body the boss. But actually, we're just led up garden paths by our sensory experiences, especially when there's a strong attachment. When you've got strong attachment to food, for example, we know you completely sucker. You just can't say no to that chocolate cake. It's the visual one and this one, isn't it? And then all you can do is anticipate this one. So you just can't wait. But the point is, they're not technically the problem. They're dumb animals, basically. The problem is the mental state called attachment, this massive neediness. And one of the characteristics of attachment is it's a bottomless pit of dissatisfaction. That's its main energy. Attachment is dissatisfaction. I just am not enough. I do not have enough. No matter what I get, it is never enough. That's mental. That's not sensory. But because I've got certain connection, let's say with physical bodies, I'll say I'm attached to girls or attached to boys or attached to food or indeed attached to fishing because that's the habit you've got. But the attachment, the neediness, the dissatisfaction, the always wanting something more, that's the cause of the suffering. And that's what distorts the object, makes the cake look more divine than it really is. So you're just led by like a bull with a thing like this. By attachment, which functions at the grosser level through the senses. So attachment also works at subtler levels. The deeper levels of attachment have nothing to do with the senses. Attachment, for example, to be approved of by people. Attachment to be seen as a good person. Attachment to hear praise from people. That's not the senses. And these are even more profound, these attachments. But the senses are pretty obvious, because this is this bag of bones we're walking around in, and then we will believe whatever our eyes see. But they're lying to us. This is one approach. It's interesting, isn't it, Celeste? Is that making sense? So this is where, for the Buddha, we've got to know our mental consciousness. We've got to get beyond the sensory. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy the senses. When you know what you're doing, nothing wrong. If Adam and Shirley have a good relationship, and he's generally loving and kind, then they're going to have a very pleasant sensory relationship. But we've got to be together mentally first. Otherwise, we're in big trouble. We're like alcoholics, junkies. Does it make sense, Celeste? So the key distinction in Buddhist psychology is to see the massive distinction between mental consciousness, which is all your thoughts and feelings, and the sensory, and realize that the senses are just like dumb animals, and the way things appear to us through our senses isn't accurate, and it's mainly driven by the stories in our mental consciousness. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, this is like an example. If I see someone that is beautiful,
yeah,
and he might and he just have that cover and
have what?
Example, if I see someone that is beautiful, it might be from inside the person is not beautiful. I'm just saying, see the cover.
On the outside, yes, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right, and that's because if we've got, you can see that. It's the kind of the classic way that we talk about men who are attached to girls, isn't it? They're attached to the shape, isn't it? True. I mean, girls can be the same, but that's where you can see you're craving a certain shape. You can't see beyond the shape. That's why you know that if you're in that relationship and all they want is your body, we can see how distressing it is, because they can't see me as a person. Well, it's the suffering of being a girl, isn't it? You see my point. That's what it is. So when the craving of a particular the attachment strongly manifests through a particular sense, then you're like you're lost, because the suffering isn't caused by the cake or by the person. The suffering is caused by the attachment, which is in the mental consciousness.
Wrong vision.
Huh?
The wrong vision.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
So it's not wrong to think that it's beautiful.
No, nothing wrong with beautiful. How marvelous. Good to have beautiful. But when there's attachment to it, that's when it's poison. A person being beautiful, we can still, conventional, you can still say there's the best chocolate cake. It might have even, what do you have here in Sweden when all the ladies come from the country and make their chocolate cakes and they win the blue ribbon? What do you call that? We call it the country show. All the country people come into the city. Old-fashioned days. Do you have that in Sweden? You don't? Oh. Anyway, we say you win the blue ribbon. The blue ribbon, that cake wins. So the cake could even be the best cake. You can still argue it's the best cake. You can still say that, relatively speaking. According to the laws of chocolate cake making, you can say that's the best cake. But you can still say, according to the laws of beauty in different countries, that's a beautiful person. Nothing wrong with that. And also, it's very personal, isn't it? But the attachment is the problem. The expectations, the neediness, the exaggerating, the distorted, and the losing all common sense. That's the problem. Nothing wrong with beauty. It's marvellous to have beauty. Yes.
What about the boy fishing?
What about, darling?
The boy fishing. What is the mother going to do?
I can't quite hear you. You're mumbling. I can't hear you because I've got deaf ears. I'm sorry. Say it again.
What about the boy fishing?
What about him?
Well, he's doing a harmful thing, and his mother sees that fish are suffering, but
yes.
he doesn't see it.
Well, no, because she has, we all try to have respect for other people, what they do. There's no point in bossing people around, just being fundamentalist. But the point was, of course, that, using the Buddha's view, we're hurting each other all the time, because of our attachment. The suffering was the attachment. The suffering for him was the attachment. He didn't, he hurt fish, but he didn't hate fish, did he? Fishermen love fishing. He died scuba diving. That's how come I met the mother. He died scuba diving at the age of 29, And she was devastated. And then she heard about karma, and she was in tears, you know, wanted to know what happened to her poor boy. Anyway, there was an end to the story, but we'll talk about it later. But the point is, driven by attachment, which exaggerates something, and certainly when it comes to fishing, or even a person who's completely attached to having sex with girls, you know, you've got to use all your power to get the girl in your bed. I mean, this is a typical way attachment works. You look like you like the person, but all you want is, you know, get them in the bed. We understand about that. That's called hurting somebody because of attachment. It doesn't look as mean as beating them up, does it? Do you understand my point? It looks like seductive and nice. But you just, you know, because all you want is that object, because attachment's craving. So it looks harder to see how attachment causes suffering. But in the fisherman one is a perfect example. He couldn't see the suffering of the fish. I remember watching on the television years ago too, where they kill the baby seals, they bash the baby seals to death. I think it's in Alaska or somewhere. Huh?
Denmark.
Wherever, also there. You know, I remember this man who was that kind of fisherman. He was in tears because these mean animal rights people were criticizing him. This is our habit, he said. This is our culture. My father did it this way, his grandfather. So when you're caught up in a culture and the whole group does it, you can't, you know, anybody with half a brain can see the baby seal was not happy. Blood was spurting, it was making terrible sounds. But he couldn't see the suffering because he was attached. He had the habit to keep doing it. That's the way attachment causes suffering. And then the other way it causes suffering in relationships is when you have all this love and delicious and wonderful in the beginning, when everything's gorgeous, but then because you have masses of expectation that she must do what you want, and when she doesn't, then your attachment is disappointed, and that's what turns into anger. Once you see that anger is the response when attachment doesn't get what it wants, then you can begin to see the suffering of attachment. Initially it looks delicious. When we see that anger is directly related to attachment, you know, not getting what it wants. Yes.
Do you think sometimes someone like fishing or with a seal or hurting some partner, maybe they see the suffering but it doesn't seem as important as the attachment? Like the suffering of the other person.
Well, that's another way of putting it, yes, because you're so caught up in getting what you want, you can still see a little bit objectively, but you're so attached to it, you can't stop.
Like it doesn't matter, maybe.
That's right, it's another way of saying, or you're even blind to it. I mean, I think blind to it. I think it's, you know, because in our culture, with respect, coming from our Christian background, I was taught by the Catholics, I'm not being rude, I'm just talking about what they say, that God made these creatures for us, that we're the boss. I know in America, reading sometime somewhere about these really kind of fundamentalist Christians who felt honored to kill and, you know, eat God's creatures. That's how they talk, because it's a gift from God. It's a view, isn't it? So when you have that view, this is not the one of fishing, that's a particular view this person had. When they saw the deer and they shot the deer, they couldn't see the suffering because they've got this other picture in the mind. And I think that's the point that I'm getting to about what we would call these emotions. They're actually these very elaborate stories we have programmed our minds with that we see. In other words, Buddha's saying we don't see what's going on out there, we see our story of it. And that's what we all do. You know, we all do this. If I just don't like a certain race of people, all I see is my view. I don't see the person at all. It's sort of obvious, you know. We see, even the way they say it in Buddhist psychology is kind of interesting. That they say that everything out there appears to us in the aspect of what's in our mind. So we don't realize anything's in our mind. We're just thinking we're seeing ugly people and beautiful people. We don't realize that we made those stories up. It's kind of embarrassing, really, if you think about it. We think it is that. As Lama Zopa said, it's bad enough that we see the world as we see it with our view. You know, baby seal killing is good, and, you know, whatever it might be. But the worst thing is, we don't realize that we're seeing our story. We think what we're seeing is objectively true. And that's what causes us suffering. Buddha says that is the cause of all suffering. And when we can begin to see that in our mind, we're on track with understanding Buddha's very particular view about how to rid the mind of the rubbish and how to see reality and thus to achieve liberation from suffering. This is a very unique approach. It's kind of fascinating. Well, we can see it, we can hear it, I think.
So it's a kind of when someone is not able to feel, example, when someone goes to the war and kill people, like.
So when someone goes to war, for example, and kills people,
yes.
yeah, then?
Basically because he's going to earn some money and because he has to be able to do that job so he can earn some patent.
So he can earn some money and get his... Right.
Some patent.
Yeah.
And it in a way it's like he saw previously accumulated so much ignorance in order to attract that situation to...
Well, yeah, the fact is, you know, we can look up on the I don't look up in newspapers anymore for jobs, do we? We look up on the internet. But let's say we look up on the internet and you saw, you know, oh, well, slaughterhouse job, killing people job, you know, or go to America, you get the job to, you know, be executioner. I mean, we might go, oh, no, that's not the job I want. That's because you don't have a tendency to kill. But if you have a tendency to kill, that's the job that will show to you. That's the job, oh, that's an interesting job, I'll do that one. It's not being rude about people, you know. It's not being rude about people. I mean, equally, I always tell this story. In the same way, that little boy, as soon as he saw fishing, he like fell in love with fishing, so he became a professional fisherman all his life, until he died scuba diving when he was 29. But another story, always I tell, which is this is showing the Buddha's view of how we come programmed with our own tendencies. It's not just a random event. Some people like fishing and some don't. It's not like that. Equally, this other little boy, he was like 3, and my friend Daichen, a Buddhist, was taking the lice out of his head. And he was crying, "Mummy, Mummy, leave them alone. Don't hurt them. It's their home." He was doing everything he could to stop her from hurting the lice in his own head. Now, both of those mothers had not taught their boys these things. This is the Buddha's view. We come with our own tendencies. Hang on. So this little boy, spontaneously, no one taught him. He recognized they were sentient beings and he didn't want them to suffer. That's kind of intense, isn't it? And all his life, he's like 40-something now, he's never killed a living being. So the Buddha's view is we can deduce he practiced non-killing in the past, and we can deduce he must have practiced compassion, because out it popped at the age of 3, you know. And the same with the little fisherman boy. Yeah.
So,
hang on, Celeste, go.
Yeah, so
yeah, go, hang on.
You
Go.
can go.
No.
You are in the front.
No, go.
Okay. You're talking and I have so many questions.
Of course.
But it reminds me with Hannah Arendt. I don't know if you know the philosophy about the banality of evil, which is when we were talking about fishing and
yes.
and killing and so, and it's so much to do with culture as well. And then you talk about the little boy, and it reminds me when I was little.
So tell me about, what do you mean the banality of evil?
The evil.
What does she mean by that?
That you born, for example, if you're born in a culture which is that you are used to kill dogs for eat.
So you just do it and take it for granted.
You take it for granted. You
Okay.
don't see because
No, I
people say
understand.
that's the way. It's the surviving.
Well, no, the Buddhist view would say that you take it for granted because first you've got the tendency to do that action, which is, and then secondly, that's why you're even born in the culture that does it. Because not everybody is born in a fishing culture wants to fish. There's the example of the other boy. And not everybody, I bet not everybody born in Denmark wants to bash baby seals to death. So culture, so of course doesn't talk about karma, but the tendency, when the tendency is strong in our mind, we can see it becomes banal. It's true. Fishing is just this, you know, and torturers are the same. Now, we don't like to think this way about torturers. But basically, when you fish, you're torturing the fish. It's quite intense. Terrible way to suffer. People who torture other people, it's the same thing. They just take it for granted because you're used to it. And that's what, it's true. Banal in a sense, it's right. But it's the habit, the calming habit.
Yeah.
That's what Buddha would say.
And another thing is like when you mention the little boy, it automatically
What?
When you mention about the little boy,
Yeah.
about
The lice.
Yeah. It not so in that level, but reminds me when I was little, I didn't want to. As soon as I realized that fishes and chickens
Well, sentient beings, yeah, you want to eat.
I don't know. I used to say I don't want to eat anything with eyes.
Of course, there you go.
They are looking at
I understand.
and all these things. And by then, because no one in my family were vegetarian, and this was back on the 70s.
Well, that's just the Buddha's view of this is karmic tendency. That's the point I'm trying to make here. The Buddhist explanation of this.
Yeah, but what they say is like, your daughter is oversensitive.
Right, that's what people
So
say. Yeah.
that's
Right. That's what
wrong.
people would
There's
say.
something wrong
That's
with
right.
her.
That's right. That's what people say.
And
I understand that. Yeah.
And then I all my life have to hear these things like, that's life, you know. What you're going to do if you're going to be in
That's
an
right.
isolated island. And
I
things
understand.
like that.
No, that's how
You
people
are
say.
not ready to do this world. And
That's
blah,
right.
blah, blah, blah,
Yeah,
blah.
that's right. That's what people
So,
say.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
No, I
So-
do. Yeah. Right. Good. So keep moving. Keep looking. Yes, Malcolm.
I understand what you're talking about having, your story colors what you see, what you experience.
Totally. All the time.
All the time, constantly. Yeah. Not me, but everybody else.
Oh, of course not. You see reality now.
But my sister-in-law called me last week, and she said, I don't understand. You say that you had a wonderful, incredible childhood, but your brother says that it was complete shit.
There you go. 100%. Isn't it true? Very interesting.
And we,
Isn't it?
same house, same parents, same street.
That's
everything,
right.
same
There you
school,
go.
right?
That's right.
And she was completely. I mean, she was seriously asking.
Yes. Right.
Because she was like in very.
That's a really.
stress
That's a
about it.
perfect example, isn't it?
Yeah.
How we can see.
Mhm.
It's true. True.
Yeah,
Go on.
but my question is
Yeah.
that how does then, and I understand, that from his karma he experiences it that way.
His own tendencies.
His own tendencies.
That's right.
But how does he then move out of it?
Well, by looking, but recognizing. That's as Lama Zopa says. Bad enough we see the world the way we see it, but the worst part is we think it just is that way. We don't. Or the other thing he says is, and this is the point, most people on this earth, not being rude, don't realize that what goes on in their mind plays any role at all in their lives, and that's the worst suffering. That's the banality of evil. We just take it for granted. That's it. So we never question what goes on in here. And this is the point that, I mean, this is what Buddha's saying. That's what he's saying. But what goes on in here is the main factor that determines everything. And that's a shock, because initially it can't be true. We think this is impossible. Because so much so, especially in our culture, materialist culture, not being rude, but the scientific, physical, materialist-based explanations of the universe, that it's exactly the opposite. Everything out there is what it is and is the source. So this one, it's not as if there's not reality out there, but this is Buddha's point. The more you look into what the mind is, the more, and that's why we get to emptiness, when finally the Buddha would say, there is nothing from the side of an object. And this sounds utterly nihilistic, that makes it what it is. Everything is merely labelled. This is too shocking for our minds initially, That's why it takes time to get to it. But this is what this discussion is leading us to. Buddha's ultimate view. What comes from the mind.
Because every mental mind.
Everything comes from the mind.
We've been labelling things
Every
so
second.
constantly
Yeah.
that we can't stop it.
Because it's habit, that's right.
Yeah.
Addicted. Basically, that's all karma is, just addiction. Habit, yeah.
So what?
Hang on, Celeste.
Sorry.
It's good.
Actually, I'm going to change the subject a little bit, so continue.
Depends what your question is.
Mourning and death.
Who?
Mourning.
Mourning?
And death.
Mourning and death.
No, mourning.
Yes,
to
for
be-
people who die. What's the
yeah.
question?
How to...
Understand
Well,
it in this way.
Because we are attached to
Yeah, cool.
life.
I understand.
But how do you deal when someone
I understand,
dear to you
darling.
passes
Okay,
away?
I'll just keep it in my head for a second.
Okay, so
Thank you. Go on, who else? We had a question.
So, in what way? So, if I feel fear, anger, or that's a good sign then, because then I know there is something there to find. But let's say I really love to do something, like the boy who liked fishing.
Yes,
I mean, he couldn't see it.
that's right. That's
So
the tragedy.
but in what ways could he have found out?
By hearing it.
When,
Lots of people I know have stopped killing, stopped lying, stopped cheating. Lots of people, I mean, every one of us in this room, if let's say you've decided, we change our minds all the time. We've all got the tendency to do it, so it's a question of hearing it, But some people might not hear it. It's up to how strong the other habit is. It's up to the person whether the habit is that strong, If the habit's very strong and the culture does it this way, like, even the boy who was bashing the baby seals to death, when the animal rights person suggested that the animal was suffering, which seems fairly evident if the blood is spurting out, but he couldn't see it. And that's often too because the whole culture does it. He feels safe. If everybody criticised him, he'd be very distressed. If you go around bashing baby seals to death at the middle of the night when no one saw him, because he'd become a bad reputation, So there's a lot of other factors involved there. Do you see what I'm saying? Attachment to what people think of you is a very big one. Yes, Celeste, what point were you making, darling?
My question was continuing this
Yes.
situation because Dalai Lama mentioned that when one practice in this life practice so much the act of killing.
Sorry, darling, say it again.
When
The Dalai Lama mentioned what?
That when one person practice the action of killing.
When one person
action,
does a lot of killing, yeah.
Yeah, killing. Also, he has to vanish, has to go. He also has to die quickly.
Right, no, that's just one of the consequences. We'll go maybe more detail in the weekend about karma and how it works, darling. It's getting too precise now. We'll go into this in more detail in the weekend.
Yeah, and another situation is why because why it makes example in my community we face discrimination, racism,
Right.
things like that.
Exactly.
How can we, when we live in this sensorial reality,
I understand.
how can we deal with?
Well, darling, this is I mean, how you? In other words, one question you're asking is, if who you are in this life is seen a certain way by other people and they criticize us, how do we deal with it? Well, it's quite hard, isn't it? I mean, it's join the club. So for some people, it's more hard than others, depending on where you're born and who you are, and like it must be. It's very, and this is very, very painful and very intense. And I think both of these will go in more detail in the weekend about karma. Okay, can you wait till then? Good. Thank you, darling. Who else had a question? Yes, down the back.
Thank you.
Good.
So you said being your own therapist entails that you have to do like mindfulness practices or like single point focusing.
No, well, no, I was suggesting that, well, no, I didn't say it, but let me say it now. There's two kinds of meditation, two kinds of ways of using your mind in Buddhism, labeled meditation. The first one is this one of getting some focus or, utilizing this state of mind called not forgetfulness, which is what mindfulness is, so we can get some focus, so we can step out of the mess, so we can see it and hear it more clearly. But then the real work of being your own therapist then starts. Unpacking and unraveling and arguing and listening to all the stories and trying to question the assumptions of all these painful emotions. That's the being your own therapist part. That's where the real work starts. The first one's just the beginning.
Okay, so the process is more of a listening instead of like a digging into it, because when you were describing the process going down the layers,
right,
the ego grasping, that sounded like a deeply intellectual endeavor, which like
it is indeed. It's analysis
in the sense of like thinking.
No, there's no question. It's definitely that. Absolutely, there's no question. It's like if you learn, you're learning to be a doctor and you're studying the disease of a certain kind of cancer. You've got the theories, right? But you have to be using super clear focus and analysis to start opening up that thing and looking at it under your thing to know precisely the cause and why and what. That is exactly being your own therapist. It's not just lying there being mindful. That's a real misconception. I'm not saying you're suggesting that. That just becomes kind of like ignorance. You've got to use intelligence. That's what they mean, actually. There's many kinds of... Okay, in Buddhist tradition, they talk about single-point concentration meditation, or shamatha, and then there's vipassana, which means insight. So the commonest one that's taught, that's known by even people who call them vipassana practitioners, is a certain type of insight into the body and things, isn't it? I mean, I've never done it. But there's a one called special insight, which is insight into emptiness. And this technique is where you use super focused mind to do really clear, logical deconstructing and basic unpacking of all the misconceptions to use logic to argue with ego's misconceptions. It's like being your own therapist in this way is the real job of being a Buddhist, to change your mind fundamentally. It's like cognitive therapy, really subtle, refined cognitive therapy. Unhearing nakedly the lies that all these emotions tell us that ego's voices support, that we spend our lives supporting, to prove to ourselves that they're liars. You're using all the intelligence and wisdom in your mind to argue with these nonsense views. That's how you change your mind. Does it make sense? Does it make sense? Yeah. No, I'm this gentleman. He's thinking about it.
So I'm not really sure like how I should practice this like deep layering down practice you were just describing. I understand like the mindfulness practice. And
yes, of course. That's right.
I'm not like the best at it yet.
Of course.
But the deep layering and like that I have no idea how to start.
No, darling, I think you do. I think I was saying it that way, meaning in the long term. But I think, have you ever in your day had been annoyed with somebody? Let's say being annoyed with somebody.
Sure.
Okay, and sometimes you have you ever done some internal thinking and got to the point where you decided you wouldn't say it?
Yes.
Well, that's called being your own therapist.
Yay.
And at the simplest level, arguing with yourself. Come on, Robina, shut up. He didn't really mean it. Give it a break. The poor man can't help it. He's sick. Don't be so mean. Hello, darling. How are you? You just did some work on your mind. You changed your view. So even the simplest level of it, that's what this is. And I'm just saying, at a more deeper level, you're going this kind of digging down, unpacking, and seeing all the assumptions. That's a more sophisticated way of putting it. But in the end, it's listening to your thoughts. Before you blurt it out the mouth, you think it through and you come to another decision. That's what I'm talking about, darling. We all do it. But doing this continuously, ever more deeply, as we understand Buddhist view more deeply. You understand me now?
Thanks.
Good. Okay, great. Meaning it's being conscious. We can see in this world. Okay, I can see. Okay, and this is a very interesting point. The very first entry point into Buddhism is actually, don't start looking at your mind yet. That's like high school. Junior school is, you know what, Robina? Back off and behave nicely. Do what your grandma says. Don't kill, don't lie, don't steal. And that would also imply don't stuff too much chocolate cake in. So in other words, Buddha's saying if you can control your behaviour, control your body and speech, which already does demand mental effort, but it's your body and speech that you're controlling, then you're going to calm your whole mind down. Now it's easy to go to high school and get mindfulness and really see what's going on in your head. But, you know, I know in my life, because my behaviour was so uncontrolled, you know, the moment I felt something, it was out the mouth. I didn't hesitate. I was proud that I spoke what I felt, you know. So, I mean, it was a disaster. And it's taken me years. Even still, I'm 70 this year and I'm still working on it, you know, controlling my body and speech. And we can see the miracle of this if you can do it. Because when you control your body and speech, at least you don't harm others. Then you begin to get some sanity and you start to be stepping back slightly and noticing what's going on. Then you can really work on your mind. But if our body and speech are out of control, we can never get mindfulness till the cows come home. Forget about being your own therapist. Do you see what I'm saying?
And Robina, Buddha outlined those by giving you the steps, right?
That's right.
The right speech, the right...
All that stuff, yeah.
Yeah, that's the steps, really.
It's all laid out. And in different ways it's packaged as well. The lamb rim is Tibetan packaging. The very first level is just control your body. It sounds so boring, control your body and speech, you know. It doesn't sound like spiritual practice at all. You know, because we think of don't do this and don't do that as being someone suffocating me. But it's really reasonable, you know. And it's, yeah, anyway.
My last question?
We're who? Celeste, what's the question? But darling, you're going to come the weekend.
Yes.
Well, can you keep it till the weekend?
Okay.
You've got all these questions because you've been reading and studying. It'll all come out on the weekend, Celeste, I promise. It will, I promise you. Keep it till then. Okay. Yes.
How about this non-killing thing?
Yes.
Because Buddhists are not vegetarians, and I can't.
Put these two together. No, or some Buddhists. I mean, some Buddhists are. Some Buddhists aren't.
Understand.
Well, I think it's not that simple. I mean, you know, we talk about always vegetarian, but we never worry about people who wear leather shoes. It's the same thing. We use things that have come from animal. We can see that. It's very clear. But it's okay. On the one side, you can't argue that if you really... I remember one Tibetan Lama, he was asked about vegetarian. He said, probably eating meat lessens your compassion. So in one sense, the reason to be vegetarian is for your sake, not for the animals. I think in this sophisticated world of a global blah, 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 you know, if there's a lamb, you know, and you're going to order one lamb chop or not in one restaurant in Stockholm, and you know it was the rib of a lamb in New Zealand gambling around 6 months ago, I don't think with a sophisticated world the way the world is now, that's going to have the slightest effect if you stop eating meat. It's going to be, I think, the tipping point. Hang on, does that Adam want to say something?
Oh, no,
Adam, what? You're just stretching.
I started to back up what you were saying. I think.
Well, let me finish. Hey, Adam, I haven't finished. Shut up.
Oh.
In a minute, you can have a word. I'm trying to give an overview. Okay. Then don't think that's not. If we analyse it, it's unbelievably important to have the aspiration not to be part of the harm of live beings. So therefore, don't wear leather shoes. You think, no, I'm not going to chop live fish. But don't think you're saving animals. I think that's the biggest. And then someone comes and orders a fish. How are you helping fish? If I don't eat meat, I'm not harming animals. Very much when you're vegetarian. I'm not being rude here. It's an important point. So I think we need to be practical and realise the main reason to be vegetarian is for your own sake, to develop your own mind. And then what a bonus if you also can save a life of an animal. That's when it's very beneficial, but it's very rare that we do that. Are you seeing my point? So that's one side, just one point to make. The other point is this. When you look at any action we do, and we were going to go to this in the weekend, there's no time to do it now in more detail, it's very precise the way karma works. Everything is intention, your motivation, the situation, the time, a million scenarios of eating meat. Each could be different depending on the person. You know, like for example, a friend of mine who became a monk, his family were one of the richest butcher families in Australia. Now, he had never killed a living being, but he got all his riches and his fancy cars and his lifestyle from the death of billions of animals. So Lama Yeshe said to him, you never touch meat. But he didn't kill, but he had the connection with killing. Another person who never kills a living thing, let's say, never kills an ant, never kills a dog, never kills anything, but someone might offer him a lamb chop. Excuse me, how can they say that's negative? It can't be absolute, you know. It's much more nuanced than that. And the key one is what's in the mind. So, you know, some people say, well, I don't like killing chicken, so will you kill the chicken for me? That's even worse than if you kill the chicken, you know, because you've got someone else to kill the chicken for you. You might eat the lamb chop and there's no connection between you and everything we do in one sense does have a connection with everybody. There's no question about that. But it's not an emotion, and I think, well, partly it is an emotional thing for us in the West, I think, because we're so attached to food. No one ever goes on about, never says, well, how come Buddhists wear leather shoes? No one ever says that. It's only eating food, because we're attached to eating, you know. I think it's a big drama for us. So there's many things to it. It's not as simple as don't eat meat, do eat meat, you know. It's if you've got a tendency to kill, I'd suggest don't eat meat. For your sake. There's two things. There's for my sake and the animal's sake. So if I can save the life of an animal, how incredible. That's fantastic. But not eating meat doesn't mean I'm saving any animals. I mean, could you not see that logically? So at least you're not involved in it. That's for your sake, and be happy about that. We need to cultivate non-killing habits, you know. For our sake, it's extremely important. And as a bonus, if you can, you know, by you not ordering meat, you can lessen the killing. But that's not also, in the Buddhist view, that's not factoring in everything. One of the main causes for the lamb in New Zealand to get killed is that lamb had the karma to be killed. That's one of the ways karma works. Just how it is. And secondly, the person who is the slaughterhouse guy, we call them in Australia, work in the abattoir, you know. So if you've got karma to kill, you know, if people stop eating lambs, they're going to go kill fish, if you have the karma to kill. And secondly, if there's no more lambs left, well, the person who's going to be born a lamb will get born a fish. So those aspects as well. But also I remember even one time, you know, otherwise what I'm getting at is demand isn't the only factor in how come fish die, how come lambs die. And the reason to not eat meat isn't only for the sake of the animal. It's for our own sake. But don't think that's not good. It's incredible to develop compassion. There's no question. We must do that. And must not want to be involved in the harming of others. Because if that can help us have compassion, that's fantastic. But if we can also save lives, wow. But I remember one time in Maine, you know, in the States, all of a sudden, one lobster season, no one knows why, 4 times more lobsters popped up. That was not because Americans were ordering more lobsters. They had to just spend a few million dollars, the Maine government, to get more marketing so they could sell more lobsters, because the poor lobster fishermen were all going broke because the price went down. So the reason 4 times more lobsters popped up was because the sentient beings had karmically born lobsters. It wasn't because people demanded it. So demand might have nothing to do with whether lobsters come or not come. So there's more factors than just eat meat or don't eat meat. But for our own reason, for our own development, there's no question. Best to be vegetarian and not have leather shoes. You know, was one of my friends says, wear vegetarian shoes. You know.
Are you a vegetarian?
I eat mostly not meat. And the thing is, for me, it's very clear. I'm attached to meat. If you ask me what I like, give me a plate of meat every time. I don't even eat fruit. I don't like fruit. Fruit's boring. Coffee and meat. But so it's best for me to be vegetarian. I am vegetarian most of the time. I eat meat sometimes. For my sake, personally, it's very clear. It's best for my mind. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does it make sense what I'm saying, people? It's more nuanced than don't, because there's many factors involved. And the key thing, there's 2 things. One is for your sake and one is for the animal's sake. But the poor animals don't get benefited much at all. Not with the way the world is. Isn't it? Anyway, it's time to go. 8:45. Yeah? Time to finish or more to go?
Well, we have till 9.
We do? Oh, do we? Okay.
Yeah.
More questions then?
Are you going to talk about the morning and the day later on?
Oh, your death one, okay. Like, looking technically, all these things are going to the weekend, okay? First of all, we have one of the ways karma works between people is we have a strong history. Best way to put it, we have a strong history with certain people. Romeo and Juliet, you know, Shirley and Adam, you know? The fisherman and the fish, you could say. Strong history. Those fish came running to his nets personally. So we have a strong karmic connection with people, you know? Celeste and somebody who's a racist. There's a karmic connection, you know? So one of the ways our karma ripens is in how other people see us. So a relationship between two people and one of them dies, it's heartbreaking, of course it is. But depending on how much attachment you've got to that person. I mean, I'm not saying I don't want to sound cruel, I'm some kind of cruel person, but I didn't have much attachment to my mother, meaning neediness, and I love my mother, but when she died, it didn't make me very sad. I mean, it might sound terrible to some people, but I can say I mustn't have had much attachment to her, because if there's a lot of attachment, meaning the delusion of attachment, not just love, the delusion, it is like heartbreak. That's when that's if your lover dies, or your lover leaves you. It's like your heart's been ripped out. That's because of attachment. We suffer because of attachment. If there's no attachment, you don't suffer. It seems shocking to hear this, you know. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't have grief. We're human beings, you know? But then more and more, I mean, I know one time the Dalai Lama talked about his mother dying. Tears came. But it wasn't because of attachment. He had compassion, thinking about his mother. But then within a minute he was cracking jokes again. Whereas our attachment drags down, and we think about the person, and then we get guilty when we stop thinking about. We think we're supposed to feel miserable. So some people never give up mourning for their mother or their beloved or their boyfriend or something, because you almost think it's wrong to stop thinking about them. You understand? But that's just attachment energy. It's not healthy. But be realistic. You know. Are we communicating?
Yeah.
All right. Fine. What else, people? What we're trying. There's a million ways of talking about this stuff, but the one I'm trying to get to, which is what we're going to go into the weekend, is Buddha's particular approach to the mind, that these neuroses are liars. And they're the ones that mainly run the show now, especially in this sensory body, that prevent us from seeing things clearly, seeing things accurately, seeing how things exist. That's his particular trip, you know. And the more one practices, that's one way of saying what one is doing. Ridding the mind of these neuroses. And the consequence of this is two. One, you get happier and more blissful and more clear and more content and more fulfilled and more wise. And two, you get closer to others. It increases your love and compassion and empathy for others. Because the consequences of more ego is more neurotic, more deluded, and separate from others, and therefore harming others. This is the direct relationship between others and self. Delusions cause us to be separate, and everybody else is out there. The nice ones will eat them all up because they make me happy, and the ugly ones, I'll punch them. That's the normal world. Look at it. Animals do it every day, you know. We fulfill our attachment, and then when we don't get attachment, then we turn to anger. This is samsara, you know. So the more we rid our mind of our own neuroses, the more happy we get, and the more connected to others we get. That's finally what happens, you know. That's the Buddhist approach to it. Am I making sense? I think I have to stop. My voice is running out. Huh? Water. I should, yes. I will drink more water.
There is more there.
Thank you, darling. So then I just think I want to read a little prayer or something. We should read the Heart Sutra. Oh, where are they? They've got their course notes. That's tomorrow.
Tomorrow you can.
Okay, I'll read the Heart Sutra just to finish, and then if you're going to come back tomorrow, we'll go more into detail about the whole thing. Let me see if I can find it. Just to finish, Heart Sutra. There it is. Okay. I'll just read it and just contemplate. Before that, you've got to visualize that we're sitting on this little mountain, beautiful place, up in high in the mountains. Not quite that high, actually, I'm exaggerating. Medium high. This little hill, miniature little hill. You walk up there, and it takes about 20 minutes to walk up there, called Vulture Peak, where Buddha gave a lot of his talks, okay? But it's a very interesting scenario. One of the ways Buddha gave his teachings was he's sitting there, and this is one of these, he's sitting there in meditation, and then two people, Shariputra and then Avalokitesvara, but in human form, 10th level bodhisattva, they're having a conversation, and basically they're channeling Buddha. It's called Buddha's teaching, but they're doing the talking. He's just sitting there in meditation. It's kind of curious. That's how he gave some of his teachings. He kind of zapped their minds and they spoke the words. So you visualize that. But also, as you say, I remember one time I asked one of our lamas in San Francisco, because it says, sitting there with a great host of monks and a great host of bodhisattvas. Well, if you've been there, you know how miniature it is. About 20 people can fit. So I said to this lama, where do they all sit? He said, oh, in the sky. So we visualized we're at Vulture Peak, surrounded by a great host of bodhisattvas and those in the sky. And Lord Buddha's there in meditation, and we're listening to this conversation. So thus have I heard at one time. The Lord was dwelling in Vajragiya on Vulture Peak Mountain, together with a great host of monks and a great host of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Lord was composed in the concentration on the course of dharmas called profound illumination. So at that time also, the noble Lord Avalokita, the Bodhisattva and Mahasattva, so it's Chenrezig, but in human form, it seems. In the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, the perfection of wisdom is a unique Mahayana way of describing the wisdom that understands emptiness, okay? We'll discuss this tomorrow. And he looked down. He beheld that even the five aggregates in their own being are empty. So then, through the inspiration of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said to the noble Lord Avalokita, the Bodhisattva and Mahasattva, how should any son or daughter of the lineage train who wishes to practice the profound perfection of wisdom? So then the noble Lord Avalokita, the Bodhisattva and Mahasattva, spoke to the Venerable Shariputra as follows. Shariputra, any son or daughter of the lineage who wishes to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it thus. He or she should correctly and repeatedly behold even those five aggregates as empty. So basically what's going to happen now is a list. All this is when it starts to say there's no this and no that and no this and no that. All this is a list of all the components of the universe according to the Buddhist way of describing the universe. So it's the four noble truths, the 12 links of dependent arising, the 5 aggregates, the 18 constituents of this and that. There's these categories of phenomena according to Buddha's view. That's all these lists of things, okay? And what he's saying is, form is empty. Form is the first of the 5 aggregates, which is Buddha's way of describing the components of a person, okay? Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Emptiness does not differ from form, and form does not differ from emptiness. And we're going to go into this tomorrow. Likewise, feelings, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. So Shariputra, all phenomena are emptiness, without differentiating marks. They are not produced or stopped, not defiled, and not immaculate, not deficient, and not complete. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. No visual form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no tangible, and no mental object. There is no I element, and so forth, up to no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so forth, up to no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Likewise, there is no suffering, causes, cessation, or path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas abide, relying on the perfection of wisdom, without obscurations of thought, and so are unafraid. Transcending perverted views, they attain the end, nirvana. All the Buddhas existing in the three times, relying on the perfection of wisdom, fully awaken to the highest perfect enlightenment. Therefore one should know that the mantra of the perfection of wisdom is the mantra of great knowledge, the highest mantra, the unequaled mantra, the mantra that allays all suffering, the truth since it is nothing wrong. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is proclaimed. Tayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi.